They said I was acting like a child with money. Imagine that. At 78, a child. I can still hear the sharp click of Claire's voice, the way it cut the air like a receipt tearing from a register. She said it in that careful tone she uses when she thinks she's being patient, the one she must practice on her own children when they spill juice on the sofa or leave crayons in their pockets. Only this time, it wasn't her kids. It was me, her mother, the woman who once worked double shifts balancing ledgers while she slept soundly upstairs with a full belly and clean sheets. I had just come home from the pharmacy when it happened. I'd tried to pay for my prescriptions, the same ones she insists I take on time, and the card reader blinked red. Declined. The young cashier whispered that maybe I'd used the wrong PIN, that maybe I wanted to try another card, and I smiled like it didn't sting. But the truth is, something inside me folded right then. I walked home slower than usual, holding the paper bag close, as if it could keep me from unraveling. That evening, Claire called, her voice syrupy with practiced concern. "Mom, don't panic," she said. "I canceled the visa. You've been spending a lot lately, and with all the scams targeting seniors, I just thought it would be safer if I managed things from now on." Managed. That's what she called it. As if I were an unruly account that needed oversight. I said nothing for a while. Just listened to the sound of my own breathing. That faint, uneven rhythm that comes when you've been caught off guard but don't want to show it. I wanted to ask her what I'd spent too much on. Maybe the groceries she likes to take home when she visits, or the birthday gift I mailed to her son that she never mentioned receiving. But the words caught somewhere between my throat and my pride. She filled the silence easily. She's good at that. "Don't be upset, Mom," she continued. "I know how independent you like to feel, but you've got to admit, sometimes you get carried away." Carried away. That was the moment I realized she wasn't talking about money. She was talking about me, about my existence, my movements, my small indulgences that she now measured like calories. I hung up soon after, politely, and sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the silver kettle I'd bought last month, the one she said was too fancy for one person. It shimmered under the fluorescent light, like a defiant thing, unnecessary, yet perfect. I made tea anyway, just to hear the whistle. I live in a modest apartment now, a one-bedroom on the second floor of a building that smells faintly of sea air and dust. The walls are thin enough that I can hear the neighbor's television, a constant stream of game shows and commercials about reverse mortgages and arthritis relief. I used to laugh at those ads. Now, I just listen. The rent is paid from my pension and the careful savings I built over decades working as an accountant. Numbers were my language. They behaved. They made sense. People didn't. My husband, Paul, used to say I had a ledger for a heart, all columns and precision. But he was wrong. I just learned early that emotion without structure collapses. Maybe that's why Claire thinks she needs to save me from myself, because she never understood that balance wasn't something I feared. It was something I created. After the call, I sat by the window with my tea cooling in my hands and watched the streetlights blink on one by one. The evening air carried the smell of fried food from the diner across the street and the low hum of tires on asphalt. Ordinary sounds. But everything felt tilted, slightly unreal. I thought of all the times I'd told Claire to be careful with credit, to read the statements, to never let anyone else control her finances. I remember showing her how to balance a checkbook when she was 12. She'd rolled her eyes, impatient even then, and said, "Who even uses checks anymore?" Now, all these years later, she'd use that same knowledge to box me in. I suppose it didn't start with the card. Control never does. It starts with soft edges, reminders to take my pills, suggestions about safer neighborhoods, gentle corrections about what's age-appropriate. It starts with love wearing the mask of management. Claire is successful, I'll give her that. Corporate job, well-kept house, children who call me grandma, with a kind of distracted fondness. She believes efficiency is the same as care. She thinks if she organizes me, she protects me. But what she doesn't see, what most children don't see, is that aging doesn't make you simpler. It makes you sharper in quieter ways. You notice the small trespasses. You count them. That night, I opened my wallet and took out the canceled card. I turned it over in my hand, tracing the embossed numbers with my thumb. It felt heavier than usual, though maybe that was just me realizing what it represented. Not plastic. Power. Or at least the illusion of it. I'd used that card for small pleasures. Coffee at the bookstore, a donation to the animal shelter, the occasional online order for something I didn't need but liked anyway. Things that made the days feel like mine. I set it on the table beside the kettle and watched the reflection of the ceiling light bend across its surface. There's a kind of quiet humiliation in being told you can't be trusted with your own life. It's like being erased politely. Later, I went through my drawers looking for the old files I'd kept from work. Tax returns, pension records, bank statements. My hands trembled a little, not from weakness, but from purpose. I wanted to see in black and white that I still existed somewhere in the arithmetic of the world. Each paper I unfolded was a small resurrection. Proof of labor, of competence, of a mind once relied upon. I found my old business card too, slightly yellowed, with my name, Martha Lang, CPA, printed neatly in blue. I held it like a relic from another life, one where my signature meant something. Around midnight, I made another cup of tea and sat on the balcony. The air was warm, humming with the sound of crickets and distant traffic. I thought of Claire as a little girl, how she used to sit on the floor beside me while I worked, drawing with her colored pencils on scrap paper. She'd pretend she was doing her own big girl math, filling the margins with loops and swirls. I kept some of those papers for years. I remember one where she'd written, in big, uneven letters, "Mom is smart." I wonder when that changed. When did smart become stubborn and independent become difficult? Maybe around the same time she decided that care meant control. I know she believes she's protecting me. That's what stings most. It's easier to fight cruelty than condescension wrapped in love. She tells her friends she worries about me living alone, that she's taking steps to keep me safe. They probably applaud her. People love the story of the dutiful daughter. They never ask what it costs the mother. The irony is that I'm not reckless. I'm not even particularly indulgent. The most extravagant thing I've bought in years was a silk scarf last winter, pale green with tiny white birds printed on it. When Claire saw it, she frowned and asked if I'd gotten a good deal. I told her it was a gift, from me to me. She didn't laugh. She said, "Mom, you don't need things like that." As if need were the only measure of a life. By 2 a.m, the apartment was silent except for the faint buzz of the refrigerator. I took the canceled card and slipped it into the back of my recipe box, behind the index card for my late husband's favorite stew. It seemed fitting somehow to bury one kind of sustenance behind another. Then I opened the window wider and let the night in. I thought about what Claire had said, about me spending too much, about being carried away. maybe she was right in one sense. I have been spending too much patience, too much forgiveness, too much silence. I've been paying interest on obedience my whole life, and the rate keeps going up. Before I went to bed, I made myself a small promise. Not loud, not grand, just a quiet line drawn inside. I would look through every account in the morning. I would find what still belonged to me. And if she'd locked me out completely, then I'd start again from nothing. I've done it before. That's the part Claire doesn't understand. I built my life out of ledgers and late nights and coffee gone cold. I can build again. When I turned off the lamp, the room fell into that soft half-darkness where memories breathe louder than the present. I lay there, thinking about numbers, about balance sheets and assets and liabilities. In every equation, there's a hidden variable, the thing you don't expect that shifts the outcome. Claire thinks she holds all the variables now. She's wrong. There's always something left unaccounted for, something she didn't factor in. Me. And as I drifted toward sleep, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity, the kind that arrives quietly after humiliation, when you realize that no one is coming to save you. But maybe you don't need saving at all. Maybe you just need to remember where you hid the spare key, to your house, to your life, to yourself. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, the air still heavy with that early stillness that makes every sound seem sharper. I brewed coffee in the old French press I'd had since Paul was alive, the one with a small dent on its side from when he dropped it during one of our clumsy Sunday breakfasts. The kitchen filled with its bitter warmth, and for a moment, I let myself believe everything was normal, that the card fiasco had been a misunderstanding Claire would fix with a single phone call. I even rehearsed what I might say to her, something measured and forgiving, because that's what mothers do. We smooth the edges. We pretend there's still harmony, even when the notes have gone sour. But when I logged into my bank account, my hand already trembling slightly from the caffeine, the truth surfaced in a line of tidy, merciless digits. Every account, except one, now listed as joint access. Her name beneath mine, neatly printed. My savings, my pension disbursement, even the modest investment fund I'd managed myself for years. All of it under her protection. It took me a few seconds to process the scale of it, to understand that this wasn't an isolated act of overreach, but a quiet annexation. I clicked through each account, looking for the boundaries of my own life, but they'd been redrawn without my consent. There were messages from the bank, too, automated confirmations thanking me for authorizing new account management protocols. Except I hadn't authorized anything. I scrolled through my emails, searching for the proof, and there it was. An electronic signature I didn't remember giving, dated the same week Claire visited last month. She'd come with her laptop, sat at my kitchen table, and asked me to review a few things. All smiles and soft insistence. I remember signing something after she said it was a routine update to protect me from identity theft. My throat tightened as I realized I'd signed away my own autonomy with a single careless stroke of my finger on a touchscreen. I should have been furious, but fury takes energy, and what I felt in that moment was something heavier, slower, like grief. Grief for my own gullibility, for the way I'd wanted to believe her tone of care meant safety. I sat back in the chair, staring at the screen, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Outside, the first thin ribbon of sunlight slipped across the window pane, turning the table's edge gold. The beauty of it made the betrayal worse somehow, the way life insists on moving gently even as yours cracks open. When Claire called that afternoon, Her voice was bright, casual, almost cheerful. "Mom, I noticed you logged into the account this morning," she said. "Just wanted to check in. I know it's a lot of change, but this is for the best. You've always been good with money, but it's time to let someone else take the wheel." Take the wheel. The phrase lodged in my mind like a shard. I was no passenger in my own life, but she'd already buckled me into the back seat without asking. I asked her carefully why she'd done it without telling me. She sighed, the way she does when she's tired of explaining herself to people she thinks can't understand. "Mom, you forget things sometimes. Remember when you double-paid the electricity bill last year?" I remembered. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was a timing overlap, a payment scheduled early. I tried to tell her that, but she was already speaking over me. "You worry too much about independence. It's exhausting for everyone." For everyone. The sentence hit harder than she knew. Independence, to her, was a burden. To me, it was oxygen. After the call, I printed every bank statement I could access and spread them across the table. Columns of numbers, precise and cold. It looked like an autopsy report for a life still breathing. I traced the transactions with my pen, the small purchases that had apparently been judged too extravagant. A bakery near the pier, a charity donation, a subscription to a digital newspaper. Petty indulgences, all of them, but each one had been an act of choosing. I hadn't realized until that moment how much choice costs once someone else starts keeping the ledger. I marked the date when her name first appeared beside mine, April 14th, the anniversary of my mother's death. That irony wasn't lost on me. My mother used to say, "They take your hands gently so you won't notice when they tie them." That evening, I went for a walk. The sun was low, bleeding into the water, the air thick with salt and the distant hiss of waves breaking against the shore. I passed the bakery where I used to sit on Tuesdays with a cinnamon bun and a crossword. The woman behind the counter saw me and waved. "Haven't seen you in a while, Miss Lang," she called. I smiled weakly and said something about being busy, but inside, I felt a wave of shame so absurd, I wanted to laugh. Imagine being embarrassed about not being able to buy a pastry in a town where you've lived for 40 years. I walked further than usual, past the marina, until the sky turned violet. My knees ached, but I didn't stop. I needed the ache, something real that I could locate, something that wasn't digital or authorized by anyone else. When I got home, the answering machine blinked with a new message. Claire again, reminding me to check my mail because she'd sent me a packet about financial guardianship options. The phrase made me dizzy. Guardianship, as if I were a ward, a fragile artifact to be curated. I poured myself a small glass of wine and sat in the dark, the envelope unopened on the counter. I didn't need to read it. I already knew what it said. Legal language wrapped around a simple truth. She didn't trust me to exist unsupervised. I thought of all the forms I'd filled out in my lifetime. Mortgages, insurance policies, tax filings, and how each signature had built a version of stability. Now, a new document, one I hadn't even read, had unbuilt it all. I wish I could say that was when I decided to fight back, that I stood up straight and found my resolve like a heroine in some tidy story. But I didn't. I went to bed early, curling under the thin blanket, the air conditioner humming softly above me. I felt hollowed out, like someone had quietly reached in and rearranged my organs. I dreamed of calculators and paper trails, of typing in passwords that vanished before the screen could load. In the dream, Claire's voice echoed, saying, "Don't worry, Mom. I've got it covered." But the more she said it, the less of me there was left to cover. The next morning, the envelope was still on the counter. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The return address wasn't her home, it was her office. Even in this, she kept things professional, detached. I slid a knife under the flap and unfolded the pages. The first line confirmed what I feared: a formal application for shared power of attorney, with a recommendation from her firm's legal advisor. My own daughter had filed paperwork to become the custodian of my decisions. Not because I was ill, not because I was incapable, but because she could. I don't remember how long I stood there reading, the words blurring and reforming, my pulse slow but steady. There's a point where anger turns into something quieter, something denser. That's where I was. I set the papers down and walked to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection looked back, older, of course, but intact. The lines around my mouth, the slight sag of my jaw, these were not signs of weakness. They were proof of endurance. I thought of Claire at my age, how she'd looked so much like me then. Same eyes, same stubborn mouth. I'd raised her to believe she could do anything, that competence was a kind of armor. I just never imagined she'd wear that armor against me. Around noon, I called the bank. The representative, a polite young man with a voice like someone trained to smile through a headset, asked a series of security questions. He confirmed the access changes and said, in his rehearsed tone, "Your daughter was added as co-owner for your protection, Mrs. Lang." The way he said it, protection sounded indistinguishable from possession. When I asked how to reverse it, there was a pause, then an explanation about procedures, forms, verification. It could be done, he assured me, but it would take time and, of course, her cooperation. I thanked him and hung up, my hand steady now. I sat by the window again, the same spot where I'd drunk my tea the night before, and stared out at the road. A small boy was riding a red bicycle down the sidewalk, his mother walking behind him, calling, "Slow down!" He didn't listen. He just kept pedaling, legs spinning, hair wild in the wind. And suddenly, I remembered Claire as a child, the day she learned to ride. She'd fallen twice, scraped her knee, and refused to quit. When she finally managed to stay upright, she shouted back at me, "Don't hold me, Mom! I can do it!" That memory hit me like a wave. She had no idea she'd just repeated the lesson in reverse. I whispered it under my breath, a bitter echo. "Don't hold me, Claire. I can do it." By evening, the envelope was gone. I tore it into strips, fed it piece by piece into the kitchen trash. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew I wouldn't sign another thing I hadn't read twice. The sun dipped low, painting the walls a soft orange, and I found myself breathing easier than I had in days. Maybe because the betrayal had settled into its final shape. No longer confusing, just clear. The worst had already happened, and clarity, even painful, is a kind of freedom. I poured another glass of wine, turned on the lamp, and opened my old notebook. On the first blank page, I wrote one sentence. If they think I've surrendered, they've miscalculated. Then I closed the book and sat quietly, feeling the pulse return to my fingertips. It wasn't a plan yet, not even a decision. It was simply the moment I understood that everything from now on would be different. The days after that blurred together like long gray ribbons, each one beginning with the same small betrayal of light, slipping through the blinds and ending in the same flat silence that filled the apartment after the evening news. I didn't call Claire, and she didn't call me, which was strange because she usually had something to manage, some reminder about my prescriptions, some unsolicited advice about safety or diet or posture. It was as if she sensed that I had gone still, like a body that looks asleep but is really conserving strength. I moved through the apartment quietly, not out of fear but to listen, to make room for thought. I had been careful all my life, careful with numbers, careful with people, careful with words, but care had become a cage. I started to realize that the only way to see clearly was to risk stepping outside the glass. The first small act of rebellion happened on a Wednesday, though it didn't feel like rebellion at all at the time. I decided to go to the library downtown. It was something I hadn't done in years, and it seemed harmless enough. The bus fare was still in cash, thank God, and I found 4 crumpled singles in the back of my wallet, survivors from the era before contactless payments and digital tracking. The library smelled exactly the same, paper and dust and faint citrus from the janitor's mop. The familiarity of it steadied me. I went straight to the public computer area and logged in under the guest profile. My hands were slower than they used to be, but the old instincts were still there. Within minutes, I was navigating bank sites, cross-checking balances, following trails of authorization codes. The digital landscape of my life stretched out in front of me like an open ledger, and I saw with a mix of relief and disbelief that one small account remained untouched. An investment savings portfolio I had opened decades ago under my maiden name, the one I'd used before marriage when I first started working as a junior accountant. It had lain dormant for years, quietly compounding in modest increments. Claire didn't even know it existed. I stared at the screen, a slow warmth spreading in my chest that had nothing to do with greed or vindication. It was recognition. I still had a foothold. I printed the statements quickly and slipped them into my bag before anyone could notice. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the pavement in broken patches through the palm trees, and for the first time in weeks, I walked with a sense of purpose that wasn't just survival. I didn't go home immediately. I stopped at a small cafe, one I hadn't visited since before the pandemic, and ordered coffee with cash. The young barista gave me a bright smile, asked my name, and wrote it on the cup with a heart beside it. I almost laughed. It felt ridiculous and sweet at once, like being treated as a person instead of a problem. I sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching people hurry by with phones pressed to their ears, and realized how invisible I had become. Not because the world couldn't see me, but because I had stopped insisting on being seen. That invisibility had made Claire's control easier. No one questions what's happening to someone they don't notice. When I got home, I opened the folder again, spread the papers on the kitchen table, and traced my own signature on the old documents. My handwriting had been firmer then, deliberate. I missed that version of myself. I decided to visit the bank the next day, not to make any drastic moves yet, but to see what could be done. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept rearranging itself into ledgers, scenarios, exit plans. I began to think of freedom as a mathematical problem: variables, risk, margins of error. There was comfort in that, in knowing that even chaos could be measured if you looked closely enough. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a navy blouse and gray slacks, clothes that made me feel competent, not elderly. I walked to the bus stop with a small leather purse clutched under my arm, the folder tucked inside like a secret heartbeat. The bank was quieter than I expected, all cool marble and hushed voices. A young woman at the desk greeted me with the professional brightness of someone who has been trained to make customers feel heard without actually listening. Her name tag read Tanya. I told her I wanted to check on an old account under my maiden name. She typed for a while, eyebrows furrowing, then smiled. "Well, look at that. It's still active, Ms. Lang. Good interest rate, too." Would you like to update your contact details? I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, and I'd like to ensure it remains private. She looked slightly puzzled. Private? I leaned closer. I want no joint access, no power of attorney attached. Just me. She hesitated for a second, then clicked a few more keys. Understood. When I left the bank, I walked slower, not from exhaustion, but to stretch the moment, to let it sink in. The sky was sharp and blue, the kind of Florida day that looks painted. I bought myself a small sandwich from a corner deli, paid in cash, and ate it on a bench near the fountain. It felt ceremonial somehow, this act of paying for something with money that was entirely my own. I watched pigeons circle above, darting in and out of the spray, and thought about how absurdly easy it is to lose everything while believing you're being protected. For a week after that, I lived in two worlds. The surface one, where I answered Claire's calls with polite brevity and pretended nothing had changed, and the hidden one, where I slowly rebuilt small pieces of control. I reopened a P.O. box, changed the address for certain statements, learned how to transfer small amounts between accounts. Each action was a stitch in a torn fabric. I moved carefully, deliberately. I didn't want revenge. I wanted equilibrium. Claire kept calling, always with the same mixture of affection and oversight. She'd ask if I'd been eating well, if I'd remembered to take my vitamins, if I'd thought about selling my car. I told her I'd think about it. I told her I appreciated her concern. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already found a local mechanic to help me sell the car privately and deposit the cash myself. It wasn't about the money, it was about the act of reclaiming agency, about proving to myself that I could still navigate the world without permission. One afternoon, she called unexpectedly, her tone sharp with irritation. "Mom, I got a notice from the bank. Did you make a withdrawal from your mutual fund?" My heart leapt, but I kept my voice calm. "Just a small one. I needed to cover some bills." There was a long pause. "You should have told me," she said. "That's not how this works." I almost laughed. "How does it work, Claire?" I asked softly. "Do I need to ask you before I buy groceries now?" She sighed, audibly frustrated. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm trying to keep things organized." Organized. I bit back the words rising in my throat and said only, "I'm fine." Then I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking afterward, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of defiance. That evening, I went for another walk along the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and rain, the sky streaked with pale pink. I passed couples walking dogs, teenagers on bicycles, a man playing guitar near the pier. Life moving on, indifferent. I sat on a bench and watched the waves lap against the concrete edge. Somewhere between the rhythm of water and wind, I realized I had stopped feeling old. Not young, exactly. Just alive again, in a way that didn't depend on anyone's validation. I reached into my purse and touched the folder. The papers folded neatly inside. It was like holding a map back to myself. Over the following days, small acts of disobedience became a kind of ritual. I started paying certain bills in cash, visiting stores she didn't know, deleting emails from her without reading them. I didn't tell her when I replaced my phone, bought a simple model, prepaid, under my maiden name again. I even changed the emergency contact from her to my neighbor, an old friend named Janice, who'd once told me, "Sometimes freedom is just the right to make your own mistakes." Claire noticed eventually. She called one evening, suspicious and clipped. "Your old number wasn't working," she said. "Everything okay?" I smiled into the receiver. "Everything's fine," I said, and I meant it. Still, there was a quiet dread under everything, a constant hum of knowing this secret equilibrium couldn't last forever. Control, once taken, rarely surrenders without a fight. I began to expect confrontation, to rehearse it in my head like a speech, calm, reasonable, indisputable. But the more I imagined it, the less I wanted it. Confrontation would make it real again, would drag the private reclamation into the open, and I wanted to savor the quiet power of my small victories a little longer. One evening, after balancing the books for my own satisfaction, a habit I'd never lost, I found myself thinking about Claire's childhood again, about how fiercely she'd wanted to prove herself, how she'd resented dependence in any form. She'd inherited my precision, but none of my patience. I wondered if she even realized she was repeating me in reverse. The same need for control, only now I was the one being contained. I felt a pang of something close to compassion then, a fleeting understanding that her cruelty wasn't born of malice, but of fear. The fear of losing the person who'd always steadied her. Still, understanding doesn't undo damage. That night, I poured myself a small glass of bourbon and sat at the table, the old folder open before me. I thought about what freedom actually costs at this age. It's not youth or speed or beauty. It's solitude, the willingness to live without applause. The realization didn't frighten me. If anything, it felt clean. I took a pen and wrote at the bottom of one of the statements, almost like a footnote. Independence is not selfish. It's sacred. Then I folded the paper back and placed it neatly inside. Before bed, I turned off the lights and stood by the window for a long time, watching the distant glow of car headlights tracing the highway. Somewhere out there, Claire was probably finishing dinner with her family, talking about her day, believing she had saved me from myself. I didn't hate her for that. I just wished she could see that saving someone who never asked to be saved isn't kindness. It's theft, dressed in good intentions. I whispered goodnight into the dark. Not to her exactly, but to the version of myself that had once believed dependence was love. The night answered with the soft hum of the ceiling fan, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint thrill of a life quietly turning in a new direction. It was near the middle of July when the shift began, though if you had asked me then what changed, I couldn't have pointed to a single moment. It wasn't some cinematic realization, no dramatic confrontation, no sudden thunderclap of courage. It was quieter than that, the kind of change that seeps in slowly like light under a closed door until you turn around one day and realize you can see the room again. The air felt different, lighter somehow. And even the smallest sounds, the rustle of my curtains in the morning breeze, the clink of my coffee spoon against the mug, seemed sharper, clearer, as though the world itself had tilted just a little toward possibility. After months of being managed, of living inside the soft walls of my daughter's careful suffocation, I began to feel something I hadn't in years: momentum. The catalyst for that momentum came in the form of an accident, or rather, a discovery made by accident. I was at the library again, checking my email from the public computer, trying to keep track of the few bills that still arrived digitally. Between the endless promotional spam and automated updates from the bank, one message caught my eye. It was from a brokerage I hadn't thought about in decades, Lang & Hart Financial, the firm I'd worked for back when typewriters still clattered and carbon paper stained our fingers. The email was a notice that my dormant employee fund was eligible for conversion, provided I confirm my identity. It took me a moment to remember that account. It had been small, a kind of incentive program for junior accountants, the sort of thing you never expect to see again. But there it was, quietly waiting all this time, holding the remnants of a younger woman's labor. That evening, I called their office and was connected to a woman named Evelyn, whose voice carried the brisk warmth of someone who takes pride in solving problems. She found my records almost immediately and explained that the fund had been merged years ago and was now a small, independent account in my name, untouched, still accruing modest dividends. I could almost hear her smile through the line when she said, "Ms. Lang, it's unusual to see something like this stay active for so long. Would you like us to transfer it into your current bank?" I hesitated, imagining Claire's name on every account like a watermark. "No," I said slowly. "I'd like it to stay as it is for now. Just updated to my current address." There was a pause. Then her voice softened. "Of course. That's your right." It was such a simple phrase, but it landed like a blessing. My right. I'd almost forgotten what those words felt like when spoken without condition. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about how easily control had been taken from me, and how quietly I could now take it back. There was no need for confrontation. No need for anger or grand declarations. The power was in the small, deliberate actions, the ones no one notices until it's too late to undo. The next morning, I withdrew a small portion from the dormant fund and opened a separate account at a local credit union, one that still used paper forms and greeted people by name. The teller, a woman about my age with a silver bob and gentle hands, asked if I wanted a debit card. "No," I said, smiling. "Cash will do." I left the bank with a crisp envelope in my purse and a feeling I hadn't known in years, a strange combination of defiance and grace. I stopped at a diner on the way home, one of those places that still served coffee in thick white mugs and played old jazz on the radio. The waitress poured me a refill without asking, and I found myself humming along to the tune, something by Ella Fitzgerald, soft and melancholy. The hum turned into a quiet laugh because it hit me, suddenly, how absurdly simple it was. I had money again, real money that no one could cancel or monitor or question. It wasn't about the amount. It was about the sovereignty of it. I thought of Claire and her spreadsheets, her meticulously color-coded budgets, and realized she'd confused control with love, the same way I'd once confused silence with peace. We had both been wrong. That evening, as the sun folded itself behind the palms, I took out a small notebook and began writing. Not numbers this time, but words. Not plans, but reflections. I wrote about the first time I'd opened a bank account at 21, the pride I'd felt when the teller handed me my checkbook. I wrote about the first job I'd ever had, about Paul's laughter when I caught an error in his tax return, about Claire as a child counting her allowance and declaring she'd never waste a penny. I wrote about how every generation mistakes prudence for love until it turns into fear. The words flowed easily, pages filling faster than I expected. By the time I stopped, I had written something that felt like the beginning of understanding. Not forgiveness exactly, but perspective. I closed the notebook, and for the first time in months, slept through the night without waking. Over the next week, my routines changed subtly. I began to leave the apartment earlier, walking farther each morning before the heat set in. Sometimes I stopped at the park by the marina, where retired men played chess and seagulls bickered over crumbs. I started talking to people again, not about the past, not about Claire, just small things. Weather, books, the price of tomatoes. It was astonishing how those small exchanges, those trivial conversations, began to restore something in me that had been quietly starving. connection. I realized how long I'd been living as though invisibility were protection, but hiding, even from harm, is still a form of dying. One afternoon, I met a woman at the cafe, about my age, named Ruth. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a red scarf that looked much too warm for Florida. But she carried herself with the kind of ease that made eccentricity feel like elegance. She asked if I lived nearby, and we ended up talking for almost 2 hours. She told me she'd been widowed for a decade, that her children lived up north, and that she spent her afternoons writing postcards to people she'd never met. Soldiers, prisoners, patients in hospice. "It keeps me useful," she said. I laughed softly and told her I used to think usefulness was the only thing keeping me alive. "Oh no," she replied, stirring her tea. "It's not usefulness that keeps you alive, it's curiosity." That line stayed with me for days. Ruth and I started meeting twice a week. Sometimes we just walked. Sometimes we sat in silence by the water. But there was something grounding in her company. She didn't pry, didn't ask about my daughter or my family, and I didn't volunteer anything. She treated me like a whole person, not a fragile one. One afternoon, I told her about the bank situation, about the signatures and the cancellations, about the feeling of being managed like an account that needed supervision. She listened without interruption, her face soft but unreadable. When I finished, she said only, "So what are you going to do about it?" I told her I didn't know yet. She smiled. "Then that's your start, knowing you still get to decide." That evening, I found myself humming again as I tidied the kitchen, a quiet, steady rhythm that matched the swing of the ceiling fan. I realized I hadn't thought about Claire all day. Not in anger, not in sorrow, just not at all. That was its own kind of freedom. I didn't call her back when she left a voicemail later that night, asking about my blood pressure medication. I let the message sit there, unanswered, and the world did not collapse. I made a cup of chamomile tea, sat by the window, and watched the street below fill with long shadows. Somewhere, someone was playing a saxophone, the sound drifting lazily through the humid air. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. The next morning, I went to the local community center. There was a bulletin board near the entrance, filled with flyers for everything from yoga classes to volunteer tutoring. One small notice caught my eye. Help wanted. Part-time bookkeeping, flexible hours. I tore off the tab with the phone number before I could talk myself out of it. I hadn't worked in over a decade, but numbers were muscle memory for me. That afternoon, I called. The man who answered, his voice gravelly but kind, said they needed someone to help manage the accounts for a small non-profit that provided meals for seniors. "You'd be perfect," he said after a brief chat. "Can you come by tomorrow?" I almost said no out of reflex, but something inside me pushed forward. "Yes," I said. "I can." That night, I barely slept. But it wasn't anxiety that kept me awake. It was anticipation. The next day, I ironed a blouse I hadn't worn since Paul's memorial service, applied a touch of lipstick, and took the bus downtown. The office was modest but lively, the kind of place where people actually looked each other in the eye. The director, a man named Sam, handed me a stack of papers and asked me to review their budget projections. Within minutes, my old rhythm returned. The scanning, the calculating, the quiet satisfaction of making sense out of chaos. When I pointed out a small discrepancy, Sam laughed and said, "You've got the eye, that's for sure." I smiled, feeling a rush of something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Walking home that afternoon, I stopped by the florist and bought a single lily. I placed it in a glass on my kitchen table when I got home, watching how the sunlight caught its pale petals. It wasn't a gift or a celebration. It was a reminder. Life was still unfolding, quietly, stubbornly, like that flower in water. Claire would call again soon, I knew, and there would be another battle waiting, another attempt to put me back in the box she'd built. But now, there was a shift inside me, a balance tilting towards something she couldn't cancel or sign away. My autonomy was no longer theoretical. It had weight, texture, scent. The scent of a lily opening slowly in a glass of clear, unshared water. It began quietly, as things often do before they turn irreversible. The air was heavy that morning, thick with the sweetness of the orange blossoms that bloomed along the edge of the parking lot by my building. The sky was a blank, metallic blue, and the sunlight came through my curtains in narrow, sharp lines that divided the room like a chart. I had just come home from the community center, where I'd spent the past few weeks balancing accounts and organizing donations. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was mine. Each line of figures, each neatly reconciled total, felt like a thread binding me back into the fabric of the living. I was humming softly as I poured myself a glass of water when the phone rang. I saw Claire's name flash on the screen, and for a heartbeat, I thought of letting it ring out. But habit is a hard thing to unlearn. I answered. Her voice carried that same brittle brightness I'd come to recognize, the kind that always signaled trouble. "Hi, Mom," she said too sweetly. "How are you? Everything okay?" I could hear a faint echo of movement behind her, the hum of an office perhaps, or her car's Bluetooth system. "I'm fine," I said, careful to keep my tone even. "Busy, actually. I've been working." There was a pause, long enough for me to imagine her face tightening. "Working?" she repeated, the word dripping disbelief. "Doing what?" I explained briefly about the bookkeeping for the community center, about how they'd needed someone part-time. "It's not much," I added, "but it's good to be useful again." She didn't answer right away. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, stripped of the pretense of affection. "Mom, you shouldn't be taking on responsibilities like that without talking to me first." I felt my grip tighten around the glass. "Why would I need to talk to you first?" I asked. "Because," she said, the words snapping like a whip, "I'm responsible for your financial and legal well-being. You know that. If something happens to you while you're working, it could cause all kinds of complications." The silence that followed was so sharp it felt physical. I heard my own pulse before I spoke again. "Claire," I said quietly, "you're not responsible for me. You may think you are, but you're not." She sighed, the long, exasperated kind that used to precede her teenage tantrums. "Mom, please don't start this. You don't understand how liability works. You're almost 80, and if someone sues you, or if you get hurt, the consequences could—" I cut her off before she could finish. "You think I'm a liability?" My voice came out lower, steadier than I expected. "Is that what I am to you now?" She stammered, caught off guard. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant," I said. "You meant that my life, my choices, my very movement are risks to be managed." There was another pause, heavier this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "I just don't want you to get taken advantage of. There are people out there who target older women, Mom. You're vulnerable." The word vulnerable landed like an insult. I said nothing. She filled the silence again. "Please, just let me handle things. That's all I'm asking." "You're not asking," I said. "You're telling." After we hung up, the apartment seemed to shrink. I walked from room to room, unable to settle, my reflection catching me in the hallway mirror. Older, yes, but not fragile, not broken. Vulnerable, she'd said, as though age alone stripped me of reason. I thought of the years I'd spent managing the chaos of other people's finances, the decades of competence that had built her childhood. I sat down at my desk and pulled out the small notebook where I'd been keeping records of my own since this all began. Notes, dates, conversations, printed copies of every account statement I still controlled. I flipped through the pages until I reached the most recent entry. July 18th. Claire discovered I'm working, called to warn me about liability, tone defensive, patronizing. I underlined the last phrase twice. Writing it down gave it structure, boundaries, something to press against. That evening, I received an email from my landlord saying that my rent payments had been redirected for convenience through my daughter's account. The words swam in front of me for a moment before they settled into meaning. She had contacted the management company and arranged to pay directly, probably spinning it as an act of generosity. I called the office the next morning, my voice polite but firm, and told them I preferred to handle my own payments. The young receptionist sounded hesitant. "Your daughter said she'd taken over as your financial power of attorney," she explained. "So we assumed—" I didn't let her finish. "That arrangement is being reviewed," I said, and thanked her before hanging up. My hands were trembling as I put down the phone. That was her first counterstrike. Subtle, bureaucratic. A test to see how far she could extend her reach before I noticed. The next few weeks unfolded like a chess game played in silence. I'd move a piece, changing a billing address, withdrawing a small sum, and she'd counter with another adjustment, always cloaked in the language of protection. She began sending mail to my apartment marked "for your records," folders of documents outlining new financial safeguards and health directives I'd never agreed to. I stopped opening them. Instead, I gathered them in a neat stack at the back of my closet, each one a paper ghost of her encroachment. At night, I lay awake, replaying our conversations, dissecting her tone, the phrasing she used to frame her control as care. The cruelty of it wasn't in what she said, but in how she believed every word was justified. Then one afternoon, I received a call from a man who introduced himself as a representative from her law firm. His voice was courteous, professional. He explained that Claire had initiated a process to update my estate documents for my own security. "It's routine," he assured me, "just standard modernization." When I asked what kind of updates, he mentioned clarifying asset management and healthcare decisions in the event of incapacitation. The phrase made my stomach turn. I thanked him politely, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. The realization came slowly, but with a terrible clarity. She wasn't just managing me now. She was preparing to erase me legally, to render me incapable before anyone else could question it. That night, I went through every folder, every paper I had kept over the years. I organized them into piles, bank records, medical forms, legal documents. The old accountant in me surfaced fully, methodical and unyielding. When I was done, I took a deep breath and made a list of names. My lawyer from years ago, now retired, but still reachable. The manager at the credit union who had helped me set up my account. And a woman from the community center who had mentioned. Her brother worked in elder law. I would not be passive again. 2 days later, I visited the credit union and spoke with the manager, a kind-eyed man named Victor. I explained the situation as plainly as I could. He listened carefully, then nodded. You still have rights, Ms. Lang, he said. If she's filed anything on your behalf, we can verify it. But you'll need to act soon. He helped me draft a statement revoking any joint authorizations connected to my accounts and recommended I contact a notary. The process was tedious, the paperwork endless, but each signature felt like a small reclamation. When I left the office, the air smelled faintly of rain, and for the first time in months, I walked without the weight of hesitation. The confrontation, when it came, was not planned. It was a Thursday evening, and the light outside was fading fast. Claire showed up unannounced, her car pulling into the parking lot with the sharp precision of someone who believes they have a right to arrive wherever they please. I watched from the window as she stepped out, dressed in her usual work uniform, crisp blouse, beige slacks, her posture straight as a ruler. She didn't knock right away. She called out, "Mom, it's me," as though that should open the door by itself. When I didn't respond, she knocked, louder this time. I opened the door but didn't step aside. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "You haven't been answering my calls," she said, brushing past me into the living room as if she owned the place. Her eyes landed on the folders stacked neatly on the coffee table. "What is all this?" she asked sharply. "Preparation," I said. "For what?" "For taking back what's mine." The conversation unraveled quickly. She accused me of being manipulated, of letting strangers meddle in family affairs. I told her the only person manipulating me was her. She raised her voice, saying she was just trying to keep me safe, that I didn't understand how complicated finances had become. I told her I'd been managing numbers before she was born. Then came the line that sliced through the room like a blade. "You're not thinking clearly anymore, Mom." I froze. She must have seen something in my face then, because her tone softened instantly. "I didn't mean that," she said. "You know I didn't." But she had. The words hung there, heavy and unmistakable. I told her to leave. She refused at first, said she couldn't go until we resolved this. I walked to the door and opened it. "Then it won't be resolved," I said quietly. She stood there for a moment, her face tight, eyes shining with something between anger and disbelief. "You're making a mistake," she said finally. "Maybe," I replied, "but at least it'll be my mistake." She left without another word, the sound of her heels fading down the hallway. When I closed the door, my hands were shaking so hard I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. But beneath the trembling, there was relief. I had finally drawn a line, and though it had cost me something, perhaps everything, it felt right. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. It was from her. Inside was a handwritten note, brittle in its politeness. "Mom, I love you, but I can't stand by while you put yourself in danger. I'll be contacting the necessary people to make sure you're protected. Please understand, this is for your own good." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of war disguised as love. I knew what she meant by necessary people. Lawyers, doctors, institutions, all the mechanisms designed to strip agency from those deemed unfit. That evening, I sat at my desk and began drafting a letter of my own, addressed to her but meant for me. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an explanation. It was a statement of intent. I wrote about autonomy, about dignity, about the right to err. I wrote that being cared for without consent is not love, but ownership. I wrote that if she wanted to protect me, she could start by remembering that I am still alive. When I was done, I signed it. Not with the tremor of age, but with the steadiness of someone who has found her balance again. I placed it in an envelope and sealed it, not sure if I would ever send it. Outside, the cicadas began their evening chorus, a sound as old and relentless as time. I turned off the lights and stood at the window, watching the reflection of my own face merge with the night. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faintly over the bay, the first promise of a storm. I didn't move. Let it come, I thought. Let it all come. The storm did come, and it came hard, drenching the city in long, violent sheets that turned the streets into mirrors and made the palm trees bow like penitents. I remember that morning as a blur of gray light and restless air, the kind of weather that makes you feel that something inevitable is about to happen. I had been waiting, in a sense, for weeks. Waiting for Claire's next move, for the bureaucratic machinery to start grinding, for my own fear to solidify into something sharper. When the knock came at the door, it was not her. It was a courier, a polite young man in a plastic rain poncho, holding a thick envelope marked with the letterhead of her law firm. He asked me to sign for it. I did, my signature steady and deliberate. The envelope was heavy, too heavy to be anything benign. I sat down at the table, the storm pounding against the windows, and opened it. Inside were legal documents, formal, cold, absolute. Claire had filed a petition for guardianship, citing concerns about cognitive decline and financial mismanagement. The words blurred for a second, not from tears, but from the sheer unreality of it. There it was in black and white, my own daughter attempting to declare me incompetent. For a long time I didn't move. The sound of the rain filled the room, steady and merciless. I felt something inside me sink and then harden, like clay left too long in the kiln. There was no room for despair now. There was only response. I stood, went to the drawer where I kept my documents, and pulled out the folder labeled Records. Every email, every transaction, every piece of evidence that I had been deliberate, careful, coherent, they were all there. I stacked them neatly, tied them with a rubber band, and placed them beside the letter from her firm. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared out the window at the storm until my reflection blurred into the glass. I thought of my mother, a woman who had lived and died without ever signing her name to anything that truly belonged to her, and I whispered out loud, "Not me. Not this time." The next morning, the sky was rinsed clean, a deceptive kind of peace. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy dress I hadn't worn since Paul's memorial, and put on the small pearl earrings he had given me for our 40th anniversary. I called Victor at the credit union and asked him to print a formal statement confirming my independent account activity. He agreed immediately and said he'd have it ready by noon. Then I called the lawyer Ruth's friend had recommended, a woman named Alice Turner, who specialized in elder rights. She met me the same day in her modest office above a bookstore. She listened quietly as I told her everything. How Claire had added herself to my accounts. How she'd filed forms without my consent. How she was now attempting to take control of my life through the courts. Alice didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Mrs. Lang, this is not unusual. What your daughter is doing is increasingly common. But you have documentation, you're lucid, and you're acting swiftly. We can stop this." Her calm professionalism steadied me. She helped me prepare a response, drafting a counterclaim that affirmed my competence and contested every false assertion. I signed each page with careful precision, each stroke of the pen an act of reclamation. When she asked if I wanted to include a statement for the court, I told her yes. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote it in longhand, the words coming with a clarity I hadn't known I still possessed. I wrote about autonomy, about the dignity of making one's own choices even when they lead to mistakes. I wrote about how being old does not mean being absent, how the erosion of agency begins not with illness, but with the kindness of those who mistake control for care. I ended with a single sentence. I am not a problem to be solved, but a person to be respected. When I read it aloud, the sound of my own voice filled the room, steady and resonant. The court hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. Those days were a blur of quiet tension, of gathering evidence and preparing statements. But beneath it all, there was a strange sense of calm. I had already lost so much, my privacy, my trust, the illusion that love and protection could coexist without friction, that there was nothing left to fear. Claire called once during that time, leaving a voicemail that began with tears and ended with authority. "Mom, please don't make this worse," she said. "You're forcing me to do things I don't want to do." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. Some bridges burned themselves. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived early. The courthouse was colder than I expected, all glass and marble, the air humming with fluorescent light. I sat in the waiting area, clutching the folder of documents, feeling the weight of it like armor. When Claire arrived, she looked immaculate, hair smooth, blouse pressed, expression carefully arranged into concern. She came over, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Mom, this isn't personal. I just want to make sure you're safe." I looked at her and saw for the first time, not my daughter, but a woman trapped inside her own fear. A fear of chaos, of decline, of losing control. "I know," I said quietly. "You just want to make sure the world stays in the shape you built it. But I can't live in that shape anymore." The hearing itself was brief but brutal in its precision. Her lawyer spoke first, outlining the petition, citing evidence of my supposed confusion, late payments, which I'd already corrected, irregular spending, a piano purchase, apparently suspicious, and my decision to take on part-time work despite my age. It was a performance wrapped in politeness, every word designed to sound reasonable. When my turn came, Alice stood beside me, calm and clear. She presented my records, my statements, my testimony. Then she asked if I wanted to say something. I stood, adjusted the pearl earring that had come loose, and faced the judge. "I've been called forgetful," I began, "but I remember every number I've ever balanced. I've been called reckless, but I've never owed a cent I couldn't pay. I've been called vulnerable, but the only danger I've faced recently came from being loved too much and trusted too little. My daughter believes she's saving me from the world, but what she's really saving me from is myself, and that's not salvation. It's suffocation. I'm 78 years old, and I've lived long enough to know the difference between care and captivity." The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Even the judge's pen had stopped moving. I felt the heat of my own pulse in my throat, but kept going. "I'm not asking for help. I'm asking to be allowed to live. If that's a risk, then it's one I accept freely." When I finished, I sat down. The silence stretched for several seconds before the judge finally spoke. He asked a few questions, simple, procedural ones about my finances, my health, my work. I answered each calmly, precisely, watching his eyes as he took notes. Claire sat across the room, her expression unreadable. When the judge announced that he saw no grounds for guardianship and dismissed the petition, I didn't cheer or cry. I simply exhaled. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it felt like the first true breath I'd taken in months. Outside the courthouse, the sun was blinding. Claire followed me out, calling my name. I turned, and for a moment we just looked at each other. Two women standing on opposite sides of a line neither of us had wanted to draw. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking, "I was just trying to help." "I know," I replied. "But help without trust isn't help, it's control." She opened her mouth to speak again, but said nothing. Her eyes filled with something that might have been regret or disbelief or both. I didn't wait to find out. I walked past her, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on my face. That evening, I went home and made tea. The apartment was quiet, the storm long gone, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. On the table lay the piano I had bought months before, still gleaming softly in the corner. I sat down and lifted the lid. My fingers hesitated above the keys, uncertain at first, but then they found the old patterns, the familiar scales. I began to play, slowly, tentatively, the notes wobbling at first, before settling into rhythm. The sound filled the room, rich and imperfect, echoing off the walls like a language I had once spoken fluently and was learning again. Each note felt like an affirmation of time, of loss, of endurance. Halfway through the melody, I stopped and laughed. A quiet, disbelieving sound. The laughter turned to tears, not of sadness, but of recognition. I had not won against Claire. There was no victory here, only truth, raw and undeniable. That love, even when warped by fear, still aches to protect. That freedom, once tasted again, cannot be given back, and that dignity once claimed is irreversible. I wiped my eyes, pressed my palms against the cool wood of the piano, and whispered to the empty room, "It's mine again." The air trembled slightly with the echo, then settled into stillness. Later, I opened the window. The night was calm, the streets shining faintly from the earlier rain. I could hear someone's radio in the distance, a soft jazz tune drifting through the damp air. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of the city, of life still moving forward, and thought of what my mother used to say when she wanted to remind me of my own strength. When they build fences around you, don't waste your energy breaking them. Just find the gate and walk out. I smiled. I had found the gate. I had walked out. In the weeks that followed the hearing, time moved differently, slower but deeper, like water after a storm, still rippling, but finally clear. The mornings were quiet again. No more calls from lawyers or curt emails disguised as care. My days settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own. I woke when the light reached my pillow, brewed coffee strong enough to make the kitchen smell alive, and sat by the window to watch the world reassemble itself. I kept the curtains half open now, not to spy on life, but to let it enter. The jasmine vines outside had begun to bloom, small white stars clinging to the green, and the air carried their sweetness through the screen. There was peace, but it wasn't soft. It had an edge to it, the kind of peace that comes after you've had to fight for your right to feel it. I had not simply outlasted my daughter's guardianship. I had outlasted the version of myself that would have apologized for resisting it. That, I think, was the real victory. Claire didn't call for a while. I expected that. We had crossed into a new territory of silence, one that neither of us yet knew how to inhabit. When she finally did, her voice was subdued, stripped of the clipped efficiency she used to armor herself. She asked if we could talk, and I agreed, though my stomach tightened as I set the time. She arrived on a Sunday, the same day she used to come for lunch when Paul was alive. I had baked a small apple tart, the old recipe she loved as a child, and left it cooling on the counter. When she walked in, I noticed how tired she looked, how the sharp lines of certainty around her mouth had softened. For a long time, we said nothing. She glanced around the apartment as if checking for evidence of my independence, and then she laughed quietly, almost self-consciously. "You redecorated," she said. I told her I hadn't. I'd just moved things around so I could breathe. We sat at the table, and I poured tea. The air between us felt brittle, but not hostile, like porcelain that had cracked but held its shape. She spoke first, her words careful but trembling. She said she had thought she was doing the right thing, that watching me live alone had terrified her, that she couldn't bear the idea of something happening to me while she was busy elsewhere. I listened. I didn't interrupt or correct her, because I understood something then that I hadn't before. She wasn't trying to destroy me. She was trying to protect herself from the terror of powerlessness. In her mind, control was love's insurance policy. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wet. "I was afraid," she said softly, "that if I didn't take care of you, I'd lose you." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "You almost did," I said. Not cruelly, just truthfully. The words seemed to land gently between us. Neither accusation nor forgiveness, just acknowledgement. We didn't solve everything that day. Love between mothers and daughters is never solved. It's endured, weathered, reshaped. But something shifted. We began, tentatively, to speak not as caretaker and dependent, but as two women who had survived different forms of fear. She asked about my work at the community center, and I told her about the people I'd met there, about Ruth and her postcards, about the small joy of using my mind again. When I mentioned the piano, she smiled sadly. "I remember you playing when I was little," she said. "I used to sit under it and feel the vibrations in the floor." For the first time in months, her voice carried warmth that wasn't tinged with instruction. When she left, she hugged me tightly, and though I didn't say the words out loud, I felt something like forgiveness settle inside me. Not for what she had done, but for the fear that had made her do it. After she drove away, I walked through the apartment, touching the things that had become symbols of my small resurrection. The piano, the lily on the table, the worn notebook filled with my notes and reflections. I opened the window to let in the late afternoon light, and a soft breeze carried in the smell of rain mixed with the sea. I thought about how freedom doesn't always announce itself with noise or grandeur. Sometimes it comes as a quiet certainty that you can move through your own space without explanation. That you can buy a scarf or take a job or drink wine alone at night, and no one will question your right to do so. I thought about all the women I had met over the years, friends, neighbors, colleagues, who had been slowly edited out of their own lives by good intentions and subtle paternalism, and I wished I could tell them what I had learned. That autonomy is not a phase of youth but a state of soul, and that surrendering it, even out of love, is too high a price for safety. That evening, I played the piano again. The melody came easier now, fuller, steadier, as if my fingers remembered something my mind had only recently begun to recover: the rhythm of being present. The music filled the apartment, climbed the walls, and settled into the corners like light, As I played, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. An old woman, yes, but upright, alive, still learning. I thought of the word Claire had used so often, vulnerable, and realized that vulnerability is not the same as weakness. It's the openness that lets light in after years of darkness. I had spent too long mistaking defense for dignity. Now I understood that true dignity is the ability to remain open even after being wounded, to trust one's own boundaries not because they are walls, but because they are chosen. Before going to bed, I wrote one last note in my journal. Not a record this time, but a message, though I didn't know for whom. Perhaps for Claire. Perhaps for any woman who might one day find herself sitting where I once sat. Bewildered, dismissed, invisible. I wrote, "They will tell you it's for your own good. They will call it care. But remember, love that limits you is not love. It's fear in disguise. Do not shrink to fit someone else's version of safe. Spend your life however you choose, even if they say you spend too much." I closed the book and placed it on the nightstand beside the lamp. The same lamp that had witnessed every sleepless night of doubt, every small victory of defiance. The light from it pooled softly over the pages, and I felt a kind of finality, not of ending, but of arrival. When I turned off the lamp, the darkness was kind, almost tender. The ceiling fan whispered above me, the steady rhythm of a life restored to its own tempo. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the world outside, the distant hum of cars, the chirping of crickets, the faint echo of someone laughing down the street. And I realized that I no longer felt like a problem to be managed or a relic to be preserved. I felt whole, flawed, beautifully alive. Somewhere deep inside, a voice as old as memory whispered, "You are still the keeper of your own account." And with that, I drifted into sleep, unguarded and unafraid, knowing that the balance, at last, was mine.